Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our live session today. I'm Kevin Delaney. I'm the editor-in-chief of Charter. Charter is a future of work media and research company. We've been around for a few years and we focus on bridging research to practice to help leaders tackle some of the biggest challenges they have. A lot of those around people leadership and things like AI in work, hybrid work, inclusion. And one of the underpinning themes and topics that we hear a lot about and we see organizations wrestling with is change management. So a lot of the factors that work here are probably pretty obvious. Artificial intelligence is one of the vectors that's impacting organizations and requiring them to change. There's also the economic climate that and the uncertainty around that. There's the changing nature of jobs, a lot of it related to AI, which is also requiring this sort of change. And there are lots of other factors that are meaning that something that was kind of an old skill, this change management practice that management consultants were very critical for and C-suite would focus on in episodic fashion. This change management is actually becoming a much more regular, continuous practice for the best organizations. So we're going to dive into this today. We have several speakers who are in the process of joining us. So hopefully you can they'll join us momentarily. And what we're hoping is that those of you who are attending the session actually ask them questions. There's a Q&A function in Zoom, and there's also the chat function in Zoom, and you can put your questions in there. As you think of them, we'll come back to them at the end of the session if we don't actually pull them in earlier. So we have two of our speakers who are just joining us, Kaleen Love and Mary Alice Vuicic from Thomson Reuters. Kaleen Love is from Philip Morris International. We'll have them on video in a second. And there's Mary Alice briefly. So I'll I'll start kicking us into the discussion, and then we'll bring both of them into the conversation. As I started saying in the beginning, um, change is something that was formerly thought of as pretty episodic, something imposed from the top down. And we're finding that organizations are having to think about this as a continuous expertise. And there are two aspects of change that we're going to talk about today. The first is resilience. And so you think about resilience as the capacity to withstand shock, to avoid disruption, to absorb disruption without breaking, and to maintain a core identity and purpose even when the ground is shifting beneath you. And then the second area that we're going to talk about as well is agility, the ability to pivot quickly, to sense and respond to change, to reconfigure operations and strategies without getting paralyzed by analysis or trapped by legacy processes. So these are two related things. There's resilience, which is to absorb the shock, and the second thing is agility, which is actually to be able to move. So these are to move and to change in the way that you need to. So we're going to dive into the discussion now. I see we have Kaleen Love. Hi, Kaleen. Thank you for joining me. Um, Kaleen is the Chief People and Culture Officer for Philip Morris International U.S. She leads people strategy for the company's operations across the U.S. Kaleen has served in executive roles at places including Capital One and has worked in strategic consulting at McKinsey in the past. And so she has lots of experience with the topics that we're uh, focusing on today, including because of the deep transformation that PMI has been actually and culture change that PMI has actually been in the process of. And then there's Mary Alice. She's the Chief People Officer at Thomson Reuters. She leads human resources, communications, government affairs for an organization with tens of thousands of global employees. And Mary Alice has over 25 years of HR leadership experience. And interestingly, for our discussion, has worked in a bunch of different industries, including retail, consumer products, fashion, technology, information services, and so has seen these dimensions of change management across those sectors. So we're going to dive right into the discussion. Thank you both for joining us, Kaleen and Mary Alice. And first, I'd love to hear your perspective on how change management is different in a moment where I think it's fair to say we're seeing more perpetual disruption. And Kaleen, maybe I'll start with you. Um, PMI has been undergone a massive transformation about your fundamental business and how you're operating. You're also dealing with AI adoption, evolving regulations, shifting employee expectations, and everything else. How do you think about managing multiple overlapping waves of changes versus kind of a more traditional approach where there might have been discrete change initiatives?
Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, first of all, if you think about Philip Morris International, you probably don't think of a smoke-free future. So absolutely a company that probably traces its roots back to 1857 London and now is at 40% of our revenues globally from smoke-free products, really looking to change from a legacy tobacco company to a company that really meets the needs of legal age smokers, but through completely, reduced risk products. It's been a pretty radical transformation over the past decade. Um, I would say, you mentioned the word change management. I often say, well, by definition, like that's not a thing anymore, right? You cannot, quote unquote, look to manage change because it is just too much. I think change management traditionally treated change as something that was episodic, to your point, right? It's a point in time. It was linear. There's a from and a to, and here's our from, and we're going to go to the to. And it was isolated. It was like, I'm going to go do this from to, and it's going to be great. We're going to manage the change from here to there. And that's just no longer the reality in today's world when everything is changing all at once. I don't know, it's the Michelle Yeoh movie, right? Everything, everywhere, all at once. And so what I often like to think of, and we've talked about this before, Kevin, the importance of becoming a systems thinker, and actually the capability to bring systems level thinking to all the changes that have to be working their way through the system, knowing that you change this one piece here and it's going to have an impact on somewhere else. Or I might roll out a change to my employee population. I'm like, it's been a great change. Look how wonderful this is. And actually the response is totally anchored in a completely different experience they're having about something else going on in the business. So that concept of it's no such thing as quote change management because it's constant and overlapping. Therefore, how do you become more of a systems thinker? And then thing three, which is I think we're going to get to, is how do you build that muscle of resilience and agility together in order to continue to thrive in a world that is only going to be changing faster and faster. So it's that notion of building leadership skills around being comfortable with discomfort and ambiguity, around bouncing back. I always love the notion resilience of elasticity. Resilience isn't just withstanding. We think of resilience as I just stick through, but it's actually about bouncing back from stress and bouncing back from hardship and challenge. So again, I think you don't manage change, you lead through it by building the muscle of resilience and agility and curiosity. I know we're going to talk about all these things, but you have to keep that mentality throughout of being a systems level thinker, of really constantly tracing through all of these threads and know that one little change here is impacted by all of the changes in the system around you.
Can you, I'm going to pull Mary Allison in a second, but just to dive a bit deeper on this question of systems thinking, what are like people who are good at systems thinking, what are some of the tools or practices that they deploy in moments of pain?
That's a hard question for me to answer. I would say it's probably the two things that I think the most about are number one, the kind of pattern recognition, for lack of a better term. We talk about people who connect the dots, right? And that notion of constantly recognizing patterns, connecting the dots between things, but looking for patterns. Looking for patterns, looking for impacts, and constantly what's the second order, the third order, the fourth order, what's the other thing that's connected to it? So it's almost like the way you look at the world, right? You look at the world to find patterns, you look at the world to find the web. And I think the second ingredient there for systems thinking is curiosity. And again, I know we'll talk a bit about that as an underpinning, but if you don't have curiosity, you're just going to see what's in front of you. You're going to see this piece of the puzzle. And to be a systems thinker, you're constantly curious about the, well, so what there? And how about that? And where does this go? Which again goes back to that pattern web connections point,
Yes.
which I think is just it's again it's how you query the world, it's how you question the world, and it's how you're always constantly trying to find the pattern or the linkage between a thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense that you're not just concerned with this singular thing, but trying to understand. You're curious about how everything fits together. We're joined by Mike Useem, who is a professor at Wharton. Mike, thanks for joining us. I know had a bit of technical problems, but we're so happy you can join us. Mike is an expert on leadership, decision making, governance, change management, and has written a number of books on this topic and also has co-anchored the weekly program Leadership in Action. So Mike, thank you for joining us. We're just getting into the thick of it. I'm going to shift to Mary Alice for a minute, and then I want to come back to you about how organizational change has evolved over the time that you've been studying it. Mary Alice, you've led change across different industries. Are there any patterns you see in how organizations struggle with change, and how does change management feel different now than earlier in your career?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked that. Um, I would say so I started in retail, consumer packaged goods, and I'm now in software, business information services. And Thomson Reuters is a global company, and we've been around for over 150 years. And I would say in retail, I found that they were a little more used to change because you're judged every single day. You have immediate feedback from the customer about what's selling, what's not, whether you're in consumer packaged goods or retail. And so you have to be very responsive and adjust. Back then, when I was in that industry years ago, I would say it was back when broad-based change was more episodic. And the biggest change in my career around change management is it's always on transformation
Mhm.
and always on disruption. And so change management, in my view, has moved from less of I'm sure everybody remembers the freeze, unfreeze, freeze again. Like there's no freezing anymore.
Yeah.
It's always on. And it's about adaptability, building adaptability for individuals and resilience, and building that adaptability into organizations. And the other thing that I think has changed dramatically is the tools and resources that are now available to us as professionals and leaders. You have unbelievable data and insights that give you real-time information into what's working, how people are feeling, what's not working, what's adoption like, what is usage, what are the response rates. And so you're able to take a more iterative, again, less of that big bang approach that happened in a centrally led, top-down, traditional approach in the past, but again, followed more of um, a a very highly structured process. And now, again, it's iterative. We built it into our values. We call it act fast, learn fast. We act, we learn. So
Mhm.
you move in smaller bites and adjust as necessary.
That's really interesting too. A few things just to double click on that. You said the first one is it's interesting that retail is an industry that's used to change because they're so dependent on consumer tastes and changes in the marketplace, more so than some industries maybe that we think of as more sort of high tech or strategic in some ways. And then you mentioned the unfreeze, freeze again. I think that's Kurt Lewin's model for framework for change, which is something people talked a lot about in the pandemic. And I think what you're suggesting is interesting and provocative, that that's not exactly how change works anymore. That actually it's much more continuous, and it's not a question of having a shock, reacting to it, and then settling back. Um, Mike, can I pull you in? You've looked at a lot, you've studied leadership in crisis, transformation across industries for a long time. Um, how has the nature of organizational change itself evolved?
Kevin, a really good question. And let me just back up a little bit and say I'm very pleased to be here, even a
Thank
little
you.
bit late. So anyway, good to join you, Kaleen and Mary Alice and you. And I'm going to borrow almost a metaphor from a colleague who writes about this topic as well. I don't offer up the term, but he does, and that is life has become almost a pathway of white water. So if you're a canoeer, a paddler of some kind, a kayaker, we go from calm water to white water and then out. But there is an argument, I'm drawn to it from my colleague, that increasingly, say compared to about 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, most enterprises I'm familiar with, including the two represented by my colleagues here, have sort of hit a big stretch of white water. It, of course, goes back to the global financial crisis, COVID-19 added to it. But if you talk with people now compared to some years back, there is this feeling that the uncertainty principle here has become much more dominant. And therefore, there's much more of a premium on people like my two colleagues here to get the job done when it's very uncertain how to do it and how to get to the goal we're trying to achieve. So, Kevin, back to you on that one.
Well, what do you find in terms of organizations that you've examined how companies cope with major disruptions? What distinguishes the organizations that are more resilient as opposed to ones that are fragile? And what capabilities or practices have you found or kind of distinguish them?
Well, Kevin, nothing like a little preparation for the unknown. That's almost an oxymoron the way I put it. But getting a greater grip on how to be resilient, how to come back from setback, building a culture that says, let's solve the problem. We're going to complain for a couple hours, but then we got to get out there and solve the problem. It's all about the culture. It's about the procedures you put in place. It's about doing lots of after action reviews where you look back to look forward, all that,
Mhm.
uh, all that better served by that. And so I think many organizations, not all to say the obvious, but so many organizations, especially after the global financial crisis of '08, '09, and 10, have put in place just a whole range of procedures to help them come back from setback. It's becoming way of life is not the right phrase there, but it's becoming part and parcel, I think, of what we expect of managers, whatever their role, whatever their statute, and that is to be ready for the unknown and to be determined to come back from a huge setback.
What do you, Mary Alice, what do you find, you're in the thick of some of these things, including obviously the pandemic and other shocks that we've had before, financial crises and things like that that impact. What are the practices that have you found that distinguish resilient organizations from fragile ones?
Yeah, it's interesting. I believe that the pandemic and the Great Resignation were the warm up for HR professionals to and business leaders to the AI era. So, a great opportunity for us to to understand how to prep and evolve organizations to be more adaptable. Um, I think that um, what I've found is purpose, like grounding in purpose, is incredibly important. And when you're clear on that and values, most everything else can change. And proximity to your customer and understanding what problems that you're uniquely positioned to solve for the customer, everything else can evolve. And so, regardless of the industry I've been in or the company, that's been central. And for an organization like Thomson Reuters, that's been around 150 years, that started with putting data packs on carrier pigeons and doing, sending business information by telegraph, to now we're in AI and embedded workflow, um, getting people clear on what's the core of our business. And for us, it is informing the way forward and through our customers, upholding rule of law, transparency, fact-based information, and then empowering them to solve those problems and find ways to be successful has been core.
That's really interesting. And Thomson Reuters obviously has the trust principles, which you basically um, come back to a lot. It's a touchstone when people join the company. You talk about it and that kind of thing, which I imagine connects to that purpose. Um, Kaleen, what about, we're talking about this question of resilience to shocks and you've experienced some of these. What are the practices that you see most effective in terms of organizational resilience? And one of the ones I'd be interested in your perspective on is this question of psychological safety. Like how does that, and Mary Alice talked about purpose, and then I think there's some research that suggests that psychological safety is another critical dimension of being able to survive shocks and navigate things where you don't actually know where they're headed necessarily.
Yeah, I love that. I was going to start with values. So, plus one to what Mary Alice said, the notion of sort of stability and expectations of how people are going to treat each other and what we're all about and how we're going to behave. Sometimes, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, we talk about like the no asshole rule, but like that's really core still, that stability and that resilience to know we're going to be in it together. But in terms of psychological safety, if resilience is the notion of how do you bounce back from challenge and hardship, by definition, you need psychological safety because you have to have space to fail. And then I think, Mike, you said it, we complain a bit, we kind of go, gosh, that was not good. Now, how do we fix it? How do we kind of, what's the retrospective? How do we go in and how do we improve and get better? And so I think this notion of psychological safety is so important to be cultivating and coaching to create spaces because those spaces create safety. And safety is something that people need in order to continue to be able to ask questions, right? Nothing is going to shut down. I don't want to ask a question in a meeting. I don't want to say the thing if I don't feel safe to do so. So I think that psychological safety is a critical ingredient of continuing to ask questions, solve problems, bounce back from things because they're not these terrible things that destroy us. It's just a problem that now we've got to understand in order to fix, in order to move forward. The one other thing I would add is this and actually I saw a bit in the questions, almost this, how do you have space for thinking time? How do you make sure that you keep this big picture anchor because it's whitewater. It's the whitewater rapids and it's insane. And it was interesting. I was having a conversation with, Copilot or ChatGPT the other day, and I was like, is change really accelerating as fast as we think it is, or is it also our perception of it that's making it really hard? And what's interesting in that is that, yes, of course, change is accelerating. I think Moore's law with regard to kind of IT and technological transformation, innovation cycles, like there's factual evidence that change is accelerating in a lot of domains. But the perception of how much it all is, the white waterness of life is also because of that sensory overload, right? And we're constantly bombarded and the news cycle and attention spans, and we have a deficit of attention. And so I kind of go back to how do you build organizational resilience? All kidding aside, like in your team meetings, do you allow people space to breathe? I do a lot of breathing. But how do we allow our teams and our people just like
Yeah.
catch your breath?
Literal breathing.
Yeah, literal breathing. Because again, it's not just the pace of change. It's the perception of that pace and the constant nature of, again, the whitewater natureness of life right now. And how do we create space to pause, to reflect, to breathe? And that can be as simple as in your own team meetings, just like reflect for a second, guys. Let's just take a step back, and not at that like urgent pace piece, but space to think. And as a leader, I think we can create those micro moments to pause, to catch our breath, to absorb, versus constantly surrendering to the white water. Like just
Yeah.
take a breath.
Mike, how do you see the most effective leaders navigate the balance between stress, tension, white water that actually can generate some of the greatest creativity and performance? So there's like good stress and change that forces people to be creative, and and then the other side of that where you're talking about just stress and burnout and kind of like constant whitewater. Do you have any advice for how leaders can lead to find the right kind of lane or population between not shutting down all stress or noise, because actually some of that is probably important for performance.
So, Kevin, to put it in a bit of a formula, given that I think the four of us are in the same club, we tend to think about this with somewhat, well, more than somewhat similar notions. For example, Mary Alice got us thinking about purpose. I'm totally committed to the same point. We're going nowhere if we don't know why we're going, and creating that purpose, especially before you need to do anything with it, is really important. So, and that's one of, I think, the emergent ideas actually of the last couple of years is a well-known book called Purpose that is
Yeah.
out there and selling pretty well. Number two, though, safety, which to me means a mindset or a culture around us where we're encouraged to speak out about the bad news, that we're not going to get kicked out the moment we say, look, there's a problem. We used to sell a product in this market and it suddenly dried up. So purpose, number one, safety, number two, and then number three for me is I think before we get hit in the face, whatever it might be, COVID-19, a pretty good example, we probably want to have a lot of people working with us, around us, not to mention ourselves, who are given to the following phrase. This is the one I tend to use. It kind of captures the spirit, at least for me. We want ourselves and we want people who are working with us to be ready to make change, even if they're not formally or fully responsible for doing that.
Mhm.
So we really want to, in advance, encourage everybody to be ready. If they see a problem and they can take it on, get on it and make a change, even if you're not so formally designated. In other words, Kevin, I think we need purpose to get going. We need strategy to go with that, to say the obvious there. We need people who then feel confident that even if they have a modest title in the rank of the organization, if they see a difference they can make, they say, I can make a difference, they step forward and do it. And we want much more of that now because I think it's much more incumbent on all of us to do that since the world seems to be a little unsettled at the moment.
That's really interesting. I think that the last part that you talked about, people sometimes refer to as owner's mindset. So each person in an organization
Yeah.
has an owner's mindset that they're gonna make the change even if they're not formally tasked with doing so. And also this idea of decentralization as being one of the key ways that you actually survive big changes like the arrival of AI in organizations. Um, Mary Alice, Thomson Reuters is an organization that's sort of very squarely in the eye of the storm, I think, around artificial intelligence. You're a technology, financial information services, media company, and both you and your clients are actually, on the bleeding edge, I think, of a lot of what's happening. How do you, how do you move quickly uh, how do you move quickly in the context of that sort of change? And can you talk a little bit about how you and your colleagues leading Thomson Reuters have done that as a little case study for for change management?
Yeah, happy to. And I'll talk about it in the context of AI and when generative AI, consumer grade generative AI launched at the end of 2022. While we had been producing products with AI for over 3 decades, we weren't yet using generative AI to any broad extent. And we knew that this was going to require a significant pivot in our product roadmap, our investment strategy, and everything. So we launched that. At the same time, in early 2023, we realized we're asking our customers to adopt this new technology and new ways of working. We're going to have to do it internally and experience the journey and also leverage it to the benefit of our product roadmap and serving our customers. And in thinking about it, we decided to have it co-led by HR and technology because it has to be a human-centered adoption strategy. It involves it's not just about a tool adoption, it's about totally rewiring work. And if you want to get to value faster and help bring people along and help them see a path forward, it has to start with people. And so we kind of employed the 4 T's. Tone
And
from
just,
the top.
Mary Alice, just before you go, that's a realization that I think a lot of companies are coming to now. What they're finding is that their implementation hasn't moved forward in the way that they'd hope because of the people dimension. So you go, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You have 4 T's.
No, you're spot on. When we started talking to people about what we were doing, they're like, wow, we're so focused on the technology, we haven't even thought yet about change management. And it's equal parts technology and change management. Every major company CIO we talk to, leader, they're dealing with the same challenges around people adoption. And so with the 4 T's, it's just a simple model that we employ. Tone from the top. It starts with leadership and what they're talking about and saying. And again, at the end of 22, when ChatGPT launched, all the headlines immediately went to this is going to result in millions of job losses, and these are the companies or the industries that are going to be most affected. And so people are looking at this with anxiety and fear. And so what leaders have to do is move people past that fear and anxiety to curiosity. Kaleen talked about it, Mike talked about it, and that openness to learn. And so it starts with the kind of culture you have, the trust and empathy and care, which are not soft things, right? You have to understand where people are at and meet them where they're at. And in my view, care is clarity, right? Clarity is caring. And so you've got to be really clear with people, which we were. We initiated a global learning day. And so training is the next one, global learning day, where a CEO got on in I think the first or second quarter of 23, just saying, like, this is how the game has changed now. It's a new world. We've got to change all these things in the organization. It's going to have a huge impact on how we serve on our customers, how we serve them. And I need every single one of you to adopt AI. And so that transparent communication was really critical. We devoted a whole day for the first time across the globe. We had, over 10,000 people participating. Um, and then we went to, we also launched tools. So we gave everybody access to 4 leading language models. We're now at over 50, training tools, and then time to use to test the products. And we've since, moved beyond that to reinforcing mechanisms. So we built them into our OKRs. We built them into reporting. So how are people using it and how many people? And we started off, with a target of 50% adoption. We're now at the end of October, 82% adoption and that's AI, using AI on roughly a daily basis. And we have many more metrics that we're building in. And so it's recognition. We have hundreds of champions at all levels in the organization helping their colleagues to get on board.
That's great. So the 4 T's, so we get them, are tone, training, tools, and time. Did I get them right? Okay, that's great. And the universal adoption is very interesting. I just was talking to Sidal Neely at Harvard, and she was talking about the 30% rule, which is that in a company where English is the spoken language, everyone needs at least 30% fluency in English to be able to operate effectively. And her application for I think matches your approach, which is that everyone needs some level of fluency for the organization to actually be able to move forward. Kaleen, we're talking about this question of, agility. How do you move? How do you pivot? How do you pivot quickly? What have you found in your organization that has worked in that area?
For pivoting quickly, well, I think, gosh, we are constantly pivoting quickly. and I think I'm going to go back to a few of the things that we talked about earlier, which is sort of purpose. Why are we doing it, right? I mean, I think we constantly are always going back to, like, what is the destination? Um, I'll say in a business that is pivoting so quickly, I tend to use a mountain climbing analogy and a story. And I think I shared this with you recently, Kevin. But when I was 13, I went and I had to climb this volcano in Indonesia as I was living there. And sort of 3 things were true as we were climbing because we weren't sure how we were going to get to the top. And thing one, was we knew where we were trying to do. We knew that like the ultimate goal, and you kind of have to keep coming back to what is that ultimate goal. We've all been talking about purpose. But not only did we know we wanted to do at the top of the mountain, we knew that when we got there, we were going to have a campfire. We knew we were going to have good food. We knew we were going to sing. We knew we were going to have a great time. So it was like this picture of what it would feel like in this destination that we were going that anchored us to a feeling, not just a business outcome. And the second was, again, we've talked about this, the behaviors, the values, right? We knew who was going to stand guard for who in the bushes as we were hiking. We knew who was going to help carry what. We knew that if one of us fell, we weren't going to leave that person. We were going to be helping that person to get up the mountain. So there was an expectation of the team and the definition of team. And then last but not least, and again, I've mentioned this to you before, Kevin, we had our Indonesian guides who every 10 minutes said, just 10 more minutes, just 10 more minutes, guys. Don't worry. We're almost there. We're almost there. And I know that seems sort of silly, but I both earlier said you need to give space to breathe and pause and not be overloading the organization. But it's this notion of communication as encouragement, communication as a barometer of progress. Like, guys, I know it feels like a lot, but we're moving forward because sometimes there's a sense of so much change and you're asking me to pivot to another thing and you're asking me to go from here to there. And so it's an acknowledgement, right? That notion of communication to acknowledge and honor what we've accomplished. We just made it up this hill. 10 more minutes, guys, 10 more minutes. And again, this communication, I like that clarity is caring. And this notion of care in your communications to honor what the progress you've made, to encourage people. It's like, you've got it, keep going. And don't lose sight of the empathy and care that needs to be part of how we monitor progress, part of how we keep going, part of how we imbue the next pivot and the next pivot and the next pivot with care and team, and we're going to do it together. It's a little, cheerleadery in
Yeah.
the communications, and you can do that, and people need it.
And each time they said 10 more minutes, there was probably more than 10 more minutes, but they
Definitely
were
more than 10 minutes.
keeping you going. Mike, I'm curious whether you see, across the organizations that you've studied, the common mistakes that leaders make in these moments, if you can help. And I would offer one that I would seem to get us started, which is because they don't have certainty around where the endpoint is because of continuous change, things like what a job's going to look like 5 years from now. It's not really an answerable question. They hesitate to communicate at all, and so there's a lack of communication if they don't have certainty about the specific endpoint that they're leading people to. Is that something you've seen? Are there any other common
Yeah.
mistakes that you see leaders make in these moments of change that we should all be wary of?
Kevin, you offer up a really interesting point in that it's exactly during a period of setback or crisis that people tend to want to pull back and make themselves more certain about where they're going before they make some big announcement. In other words, when a crisis comes on, when there's a setback, if you're doing mountaineering, and Kaleen, we've done a lot of the same thing. We've used mountaineering as a metaphor in many, many ways. It's exactly when there's a crisis where the human tendency is to kind of pull back, be cautious or overly cautious and all that. To turn that into the positive, that's exactly when we want to be proactive. We want to say what we know, what we don't know. It's awkward to say what we don't know, but that's exactly when we want to say it because people are looking for what do you know, what do you don't know, and what can they find out to fill in that gap. That's a long-winded way of saying that I think by looking to ourselves when we've had a setback, maybe climbing a mountain in Indonesia, and ask, with the benefit of that as a metaphor, what helped get people to the top of that mountain safely? And my two colleagues here have already said it so well. We want a sense of mutual objective. We got a common purpose. We want mutual reliance, so we know we're not going to get left behind. Nobody's left behind, and so on. That's an indirect way of saying that I think a great way to prepare for the uncertainty that's ahead. We're all facing it. We can see it. It's coming. It's more intense than probably ever before. It's good now to think about what we are going to be inclined not to do, but ought to be doing, like getting out front, speaking,
Mhm.
building a culture, making reference to the fact that, come on, everybody, we're a team, we're not a bunch of individuals, and so on. That's, I guess, an indirect way of saying there's no better time to get ready for that uncertain future than right now.
Yeah, and communicating into the uncertainty. One thing that we've seen is in some of the research we've done is that sharing hypotheses and scenarios, we think that it's headed in this direction. Here's what we're watching, and also just expressing confidence in the team. The seas may be rough, but you are the sailors who we want to be on the ship with us. Um, Mary Alice, you mentioned, so we're talking about kind of communicating and leading through change. You mentioned briefly bringing AI, I think, into performance management. And I guess one of the questions that I have, how do you think about the intersection of, a bunch of different things, including team level management, performance management, goal setting? What are the key practices there to actually shift change from a high level C-suite objective into the really embedded in the organization?
Yeah, really good question. And again, I'll go back to AI adoption as a real example that we're working through, and how we did that. So we started with just really open, transparent communication, as I said, and then and talking about the importance and making it crystal clear that everybody was expected, regardless of role, everybody was expected to start using, experimenting the tools. And we knew that as the tools, the technology got better, we would have more role specific usage. We engaged everybody in use cases. So it started more as encouragement. We invited everybody to participate we did two global learning days dedicated to AI in 23. We've continued those. And we had both top down and bottoms up use cases. We've had over 100 submitted. We've put I don't know the current count. I think it's over 40 are in production, and we're tracking. And then the following year, we started building it into expectations. And at the point that we're at now, we started with leaders because I think that the role of leaders is changing profoundly. If you think about it, every leader today leads a workforce of talent, people, and technology. And that's
Mhm.
a really big shift for people to get their head around. As a leader, you're responsible for figuring out what is the optimal way to have people and technology do what they do best to give you the best possible outcomes. And so leaders have to think differently. We built that into their performance around productivity. So both how are we capturing the benefits of this, and how are we helping to upskill our teams so that they can get the benefits of this and leveraging automation and tools. And that's productivity on the upside. So that could be greater output in our engineering team. It could be higher sales, leveraging tools and insights from the system. Or it could be automating, like in HR, we're able to automate a number of practices. For employees, we've got them thinking outside of a mindset, oh, I'm an individual contributor. Like nobody's an individual contributor anymore because everybody has access to an AI assistant or agents. And so how do they think differently about their role and what they do? And so we put AI adoption as like AI usage into everybody's expectations. We started off the year saying, I think it was about 70%, 75% adoption rate. And by the end of the first quarter, we were like, actually, we need to move even faster than this. So it's 100% adoption by the end of the year. Again, we're at 82% as of a month ago. And we're hoping to hit that audacious goal by the end of the year. But everybody's got that. And both individuals and leaders have those reports. But it's underpinned by the kind of culture that Kaleen talked about, which is one of trust and open transparency. So nobody's surprised by this. Everybody has access to the tools. Everybody has access to the training. We've been crystal clear, and we're encouraging, we're showing recognition and other things to support that.
Great. Thank you, Mary Alice. We have a bunch of questions here. I'm going to start, and one of them is very relevant to what you just said. It's from Gayatri Agnew, who is saying, have you gotten deeper into metrics that get past just use? So percentage of use, but the quality of use. And can you share more about how you built in recognition?
Yeah,
Yeah,
the metric that I shared, daily adoption or daily usage
yeah.
of tools, is a blunt metric. So we're definitely working on getting into quality. And so a great example of a quality metric would be engineers and the code that they're developing with AI. How much of that goes into production? How much of that is error free? Um, Another one would be in sales. So who's using, we use a tool in sales, and how, are people using it? How are they using it? We can track the insights that they're using, and do they make the sale? And what happens as a result of that? What's the satisfaction of the customer? Um, and then I forgot the second half of the question.
The question was, so it's the quality of the usage, which you just answered. And can you share more about how you built in recognition?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
yeah, I
absolutely.
think, yeah.
Oh, I'll just quickly, recognition comes number one. We're leveraging colleagues at all levels to share their stories. When we put a use case into production and what we learn from it, both the positive and also the failures, and the opportunity for them to get on a global webinar and share that has been huge. We're celebrating those examples. We're also recognizing our ambassadors. We're giving them access to tools ahead of their peers, and so they're at the forefront. People want to learn. Like, people, the number one thing we hear is, I want to stay relevant. People are, nervous about falling behind in this era of change. And so all of that. And then we have annual awards and things like that where we're emphasizing these things.
What we found in our surveys is that growth opportunities are among the things that people value right now from employers. Kaleen, we have a question from Melissa Painter, and she says she loves all the points about curiosity, acting fast, learning fast. What happens when you have an organization full of good systems thinkers, but there's no thinking time in the modern workday, work week? How do you make the space, and how does fear factor in?
I think I glanced at that earlier and kind of mentioned the notion of how do you might not be able to, well, as an individual leader, I do encourage my team put actual blocks on your calendar. They're green on mine, and they're like my thinking time. Do they get pushed all the time? Yes. Do I still keep trying? Absolutely. Perseverance, resilience, but also the micro moments. I think this notion of sometimes we just go meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting. And even just that notion of as you are leading meetings, um, can you take that breath? Remember we talked that earlier, that notion of that breath. Can you just say, take a second to reflect? Sometimes when we're doing bigger meetings, and before we jump into the answer, especially for the introverts in the room, everyone write your thoughts. Just giving people 5 minutes, that's sort of a common tactic, but it's effective. Create little spaces, I think, not just the big ones. The big ones are hard, not gonna lie. But can you create micro moments where people can pause, reflect, write down a thought before we're just constantly, again, back in the whitewater?
That's great. Those green blocks on your calendar, do you have a target amount of time? Is it like, do you aim for 60 minutes or, um,
I have aspirations to have to let's put it, I have aspirations to look at my calendar and see green.
okay.
Well, I'll know it when I see it.
Okay, got it. Mike, there's a question from Jana Fitzgerald. Um, she's asking for any advice or frameworks for helping to push HR leaders who are mostly reactive in nature and less invested in proactive, big picture cultural strategies, whether because they're facing business opposition or because they're too overwhelmed. So there's an HR leader who's just reactive, doesn't feel like they either have the space or they've been constrained so that they can't be proactive. What's your advice for them?
So, Jana's question, I think, is really interesting, and I'm going to relate it to what Kaleen just said as well. I think we all struggle with finding time to be thinking, who are we? Where are we going? Why are we doing this? More broadly, what should we be doing? What strategic alternatives ought we be considering? And days are tough. We get to the office and things go kind of haywire for the rest of the day. That said, in addition to finding green time in the calendar, I like the metaphor. How about seeking out one or two people who can serve as your mentors? Or how about a couple coaches? Or how about a personal board of directors? And how about keeping a diary? And I say that, how about, implying, of course, that I think all these tactics are probably to the good, more suitable for some people than others, but finding ways to let your head get to work on what you're thinking that transcends the moment, the day, and the particular problem is really, really important. With all that said, I think the other element, just to then broaden this out, that is really important and we've used the phrase in this discussion already, think like a CEO, or think like your boss. You're not the CEO. I did a study a couple years ago of the country of Chile. I heard the phrase often, think as if you're a country president, as that country was trying to come back from a huge earthquake they had a couple years ago. Or in investing these days, I think all of us know the phrase, think like an activist. What does an outside person think about as they look at your board or they look at your stock? You're not that person, but it does give you a perspective. That's my, I guess, too long a way of saying
Yeah.
that I think we owe it to ourselves. We certainly owe it to the employer to become as thoughtful as we can, to become as strategic in the way we look at things, and then to be brave and sometimes even courageous in taking ideas that maybe our boss didn't really see, to the boss, speaking truth to power. That can be challenging. We don't want to have our head handed to us on a plate. On the other hand, I think with the benefit of hindsight, the boss is going to say, I'm really glad you came to tell me about that particular problem. So, Kevin, to wrap it up, I think becoming more mindful is pretty much what Kaleen and also Mary Alice indirectly has been saying. I'm all for it. I think it's a good thing.
It's interesting. It's probably not stressed enough for people in leadership. You don't get the job, or it doesn't seem like you get the sort of jobs that Kayleen and Mary Alice are in because you're mindful. It's not named as a attribute, even though it's probably critical to your performance. There's a question from Teresa Hamilton. I'm curious for both Kayleen and Mary Alice, your thoughts on this. It's that the onus or burden of change and challenges can fall on people managers who now probably have larger teams than ever, given the leveling of management layers. What are some effective ways we can support or enable managers to navigate change, both for themselves and to shepherd their employees through the rush of white waters? Kayleen, do you want to take this first? So this is like, how do you best equip people at the team level to lead their teams through change that might be um, decided at a organizational level sometimes?
Yeah, I think this one is really interesting because it's going to touch on some words we've been using, both humility as a prerequisite for curiosity, and then a level of courage that allows you to self-author. So I think one of the biggest shifts for managers or going from individual contributor to manager is realizing that you're no longer the one accountable to have the answer. You are now accountable to get the team to the answer.
Mhm.
And that realization should come with, and we should be equipping managers to say it's okay, therefore, if you don't have the answer. So again, I think it's can connect back to this notion of be okay not having the answer. You don't have to have the answer. You're accountable for getting us to the answer, which means it's okay to learn out loud. It's okay to say you don't know. It's okay to role model, again, curiosity, asking questions, seeking that, and leaning on the diversity and the perspectives of the team. So it's almost like, how do we coach managers to take off your superhero cape and you believe that you've got to have it all and you've got to lead through change, and just say, actually, if you can role model that curiosity and that learning, you can probably bring your team to a better answer with a little bit less, stress. It's yeah, coaching them to bring people through it, not
Mm.
to have the answer,
And not
and
have
all
not
that.
having to own every dimension of it. Mary Alice, have you seen anything that works with supporting managers?
Yeah, I think managers definitely are feeling a strain right now, particularly middle managers. There's a lot of suffering going on with that group of people, and I think organizations need to put a lot more focus. Certainly we do on that group. I'm glad Teresa asked the question. I agree with what Kaleen said. I mean, they don't have to have all the answers. I think it's more about fostering an environment where people have there's psychological safety, so there's trust, and managers, they can be vulnerable and be clear when they don't have information, when they don't have the answers, share their frustrations or the questions that they have. I think one where people can speak up. It's about getting ideas and input from everyone on the team. Change doesn't have to come from the top or from that manager themselves. It can come from anybody on anybody on the group, and then encouraging that learning and demonstrating how you as a manager are learning as well as the team alongside the team, and sharing that across the group.
That's great. Tina, we're just about out of time. I'd love just for a last sort of thought from each of you quickly, and Mike, maybe we'll start with you. What is your, what's your bit of advice or thing you encourage people to take away from this
Yeah, very
topic of
quickly,
discussion?
uh, three pieces. Think strategically, communicate persuasively, and then decide decisively,
Hmm.
regardless of who you are or what role you have, in that we do want, and we need leadership from everywhere, from every level. So don't be shy, step forward, make a difference, be strategic, be persuasive, and make the decision and get on with it.
That's great. Democratizing leadership. Mary Alice, what's your takeaway?
Uh, this is our moment on HR and change leaders. Again, the pandemic, great resignation, those were the warm-ups. The AI era needs us to demonstrate bold, courageous leadership. So I take from Kaleen, focusing on making sure that you're taking care of yourself and being mindful and giving yourself time to think. And Mike around courage, courageous leadership. That's what this moment calls for.
Great. Kaleen?
So if I write a book, it's going to be When the Robots Take Over, a call to curiosity, courage, and connection. And I know we've talked about curiosity, we've talked a lot about courage. My takeaway is to really build that culture of resiliency and agility in a world of humans and robots. How do we make sure we hold on to connection,
Yeah.
human connection, and the relationships that are going to keep us strong, keep us climbing the mountain, the empathy, the care? Um, I wouldn't underestimate it.
Yeah, that's great. I've taken away so much from this discussion. Mike, the whitewater analogy is really very helpful in terms of thinking about the context for this. Mary Alice, that phrase "care is clarity," I think is
Yeah.
really powerful. And Kayleen, your observations about systems thinking and also about how it's okay to learn out loud and to encourage managers to do that, I think are really powerful tools for people to take away from this discussion. So thank you, the three of you. Really appreciate your perseverance joining this conversation. We have Dr. Kaleen Love, who's the Chief People and Culture Officer of PMI. We have Mary Alice, who is the Chief People Officer at Thomson Reuters. And we have Mike Useem, who is a professor at Wharton. Thanks the three of you for joining the discussion, and thanks everybody else for the great questions.
Thank you, Kevin.